to the Bay Area and get answers for you in real time. Now, we've been hearing a lot about the threat of rotating blackouts during this heat wave. Today, we'll hear from Professor James Bushnell, an energy and environmental policy researcher, about California's power grid and the strain on it due to the heat. During National Suicide Prevention Week, we will talk with Dr. Dan Reidenberg of SAVE. That's one of the nation's first organizations dedicated to the prevention of suicide, to learn the signs that can indicate someone is at risk. Also, when was the last time you went to the library? SF Standard data journalist Liz Lindquist has a look at the ongoing transformation of San Francisco libraries. But first, day 5 of our heat wave and triple-digit temperatures. Joining us now, meteorologist Mike Nico with the very latest. Mike, a little bit cooler, at least around the bay, but it's not over.
Yeah, the cooler temperatures that I'm going to show you on any other day, Kristen, and good afternoon, everybody, we'd be talking about how warm to hot they are. But after setting all-time record highs yesterday and possibly the day before, these temperatures are going to seem comfortable for some of us. You can see we're up to 14 degrees cooler in places like San Mateo and San Jose, but we're still 94 in San Jose. San Mateo's 83, that's pretty nice. San Francisco 81, that's much better than yesterday's 98, but you could still see some triple digits, especially up around Cloverdale, Ukiah, and out in our inland East Bay neighborhoods and around Morgan Hill. We still have this heat building again tomorrow. It's going to spike again tomorrow. So today we pulled back just a little bit. Tomorrow it spikes. And that's why we have that heat advisory for the Santa Cruz coast, also the San Francisco Bay shoreline and the Marin coastal range. And that's until 8 o'clock tomorrow evening. Elsewhere inland, we have triple digits today. We'll have even more again tomorrow and possibly through Friday in places like Fairfield. And this is until 8 o'clock tomorrow. Now, it also goes to 11 o'clock tomorrow with places like Lake and Mendocino counties. Now, let me tell you about some of the good news. When is this going to break and what is going to cause it? Well, one of those is the cold front's going to be coming down from the south. Another is with the remnants of Hurricane K coming up from the north. Now, it's going to come as far north as Southern California and look at this, a chance of thunderstorms in the forecast. But it's also, along with that cold front, going to help induce an onshore breeze for us, and the extra cloud cover is what's going to help drop our temperatures dramatically as we head into the weekend. In fact, you can see it here in our 3-day forecast. Places like Lake Tahoe down at 80. We're finally out of the 100s. In fact, we're 20 degrees cooler in Sacramento from Friday to Saturday, from 106 to 86. Same thing in Fresno from 108 to 89. And look at the rain possible in LA and for 2 days in San Diego. So that is when the flex alerts will finally end, in my estimation. Will be Saturday, Kristen. But of course, we're going to hear from the experts coming up.
We sure are. In fact, right now. Thanks so much, Mike. So what is the role of rotating blackouts? Are they unavoidable as California continues to get hotter, more populated, and more energy hungry? How can we get ourselves in a better place in the next decade? Joining us live now to discuss these issues is Professor James Bushnell, co-director of the Davis Energy Economics Program and a member of CAISO's Market Surveillance Committee. Thanks for joining us, Professor Bushnell.
Sure, happy to be here.
So CAISO is the agency that manages California's electrical grid, but what exactly does that entail?
The CAISO is sort of the traffic cop for electricity flows in the state. It was created when we deregulated the system, and now there's dozens of companies buying and selling electricity across the state. The CAISO tries to make sure that these transactions don't overload the wires, don't cause other types of reliability problems, because when things do get out of control, it can black the entire system out, not just a random 1 or 2% of the system.
And at that point, you lose control when it blacks out?
Yes, exactly. So these types of rolling blackouts that people are talking about this week that may or may not happen, hopefully we might avoid them, are meant to make sure that the supply and the demand are met in real time. Unlike other products, if you have too much or not enough supply in an electric system, the entire delivery mechanism can break down. And instead of just having 1 or 2% not be able to buy what they need, it can cause everyone in the entire state to lose power for extended periods of time. So the CAISO is trying to keep this to be a smaller problem rather than one that spirals out of control.
Got it. Okay, you say CAISO. I think we are used to saying CAISO on the news. Should we switch to CAISO, by the way?
I don't know what the preferred acronyms are. They probably have a better sense of what they want to be called.
Exactly, exactly. Okay, whatever they are called, like they're the ones who look at the numbers and go, oops, it's time to order that rotating outage, which again, we haven't had the last couple of days due to conservation efforts. But if and when they get to that point, they don't decide who goes, right? They tell the utilities and leave it to the utilities to decide how to drop the load, so to speak?
Yeah, so the delivery system, the CAISO's kind of directing traffic, but the big utilities still own the wires and manage the wires physically. And so what would happen is the CAISO would identify that there is a potential shortfall happening, and it would notify the utilities like PG&E or Southern California Edison that they may need to drop some demand. And at that point, it's handed off to the distribution companies like PG&E, who would then decide which neighborhoods lose power for a short period of time in a rotating sense.
Got it. Now, you mentioned Southern California Edison, and I'm wondering, is the supply and demand equation done on a whole statewide basis, or is it more localized or regional? Because, I mean, I'll equate this to water, right? Where during droughts, we in Northern California are usually pretty good about tightening our belts, and then we look to our Southern California neighbors and go, are you conserving, or are you still watering your lawn? So are our fates tied together in energy as well?
Our fates are tied together, but it can differ. So there is a big bottleneck between Northern and Southern California. And at times you can see the South short and the North in excess, and we just can't ship enough power from north to south, for example. This week, it's not really the case. It is more of a statewide or even multi-state potential problem. And so it's not really that different of a circumstance in the South than it is in the North right now.
Just also want to touch on this again. PG&E says half of its customers are basically off the table for rotating blackouts because essential services are on that same grid. Is that fair?
Well, I'm one of those customers, so, I guess I'm biased on this question. There's probably better ways to try to manage that. But there's really better ways to try to manage a 1 or 2% shortfall overall, rather than having to cut some percentage of customers 100%. It would be better if there was a way to get everybody to reduce their consumption by the 1 or 2% that's really necessary to try to balance it.
Can that be done? I mean, with smart devices in homes these days, is that possible?
Yeah, and people have debated different ways. Right now, what we do is we say pretty please, and we put out these urgent calls for conservation, but they're not really backed by any incentives. The big problem we have in electricity markets is that we have really sophisticated wholesale markets where prices can go up by 100 times on the course of a day. But the prices you and I pay are really stable. They don't really respond to the situation in the market. So the price I'm paying right now is really no different than what I was paying 2 weeks ago or what I'll be paying next week. And I don't have an incentive. I will try to conserve, and we're doing the pre-cooling and all that, but we don't really get rewarded for that in a monetary sense.
Okay, so then how could we get rewarded or punished in a real-time situation?
Yeah, there's a bunch of different pilots that have been tried over the years. A simple one would be that there are 5 or 6 days of the year where your prices go up by maybe 2 or 3 times between 4 o'clock and 9 o'clock. And instead of the modest increase that most people now face every day between 4 and 9, it's really just a few percent increase. We would instead double or triple prices, but just in those few hours where we really need people to shift their demand away from. And we'd only do it 4 or 5 times a year.
Right, when we have these extreme heat waves, when power use is going to be extreme. It's like congestion pricing, but to the max degree is what you're saying.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, and
that's interesting.
we don't really look at when it's congested.
Is anyone doing this in California on a pilot basis?
SMUD had a pilot several years ago, and it was very successful. They randomized people into this program, and almost all of them decided to stay on it. They had the option to opt out, but most people were perfectly happy to stay on. And when these events were called, they're called critical peak events, there was savings of 15–20%.
Wow. Okay. Look, once we get through this immediate heat wave, we got to start talking about long term, right? What we can do to ensure a steady supply, reliable supply, especially as we anticipate more heat waves in the future in California. So what do you think the solutions are? And I say plural because it can't just be one.
Sure. And demand was one part of this. We've been talking a lot about trying to add storage to the system. I think one of the challenges we're going to face is everybody wants batteries for all sorts of things. We're trying to add more electric vehicles. We're trying to add more grid storage. And there is really a bottleneck in terms of the supply of these technologies. So what we're also seeing is a rethinking of certain types of supply. We've seen Diablo Canyon's lifetime expanded for 5 years, apparently, at this point. And we may need to rethink the role of natural gas generation, at least in the near term, to provide backup during periods when the renewable energy is not providing what we had expected or hoped it to.
Rethinking means perhaps we need to keep it around a little longer during the transition period, but figure out how to do it more cleanly?
Yes, and maybe think about alternative ways of firing these generators, either biofuels, or some people are talking about green hydrogen, other ways of getting cleaner energy, but more on demand rather than the intermittent supply that we usually get from wind and solar.
All right, just because we like to think big here on ABC7, getting answers, are there exciting new ways to harness or generate energy that most of us in the public have never even thought of or heard of that are on the horizon that you can share with us?
Well, I think most of the interesting innovation is happening around this area of storage, which has always been the big problem with electricity, that it's been impossible or at least really, really expensive to store it. And as we are looking at different materials for battery technology, other types of compressed air or gravity-based storage technologies, there's lots of thinking going on there. And hydrogen itself is sort of a form of trying to store electricity if you can produce the hydrogen from excess renewable power during, say, the day, and then you have a fuel that can be stored to use on demand at some later time.
All right, so much more to talk about. We've got to get you back on another time. Professor James Bushnell with UC Davis, really appreciate it.
Thanks, happy to be here.
Thanks. All right, shifting gears, coming up on this National Suicide Prevention Week, we are talking with the head of a suicide prevention group to learn how we can all play a role to help save lives. We'll be right back. It's an issue that may be difficult to discuss, but conversations can save lives. We're talking about suicide. September is Suicide Prevention Awareness Month. So joining us live now is Dr. Dan Reidenberg, CEO of save.org. That's a leading national nonprofit suicide prevention organization. Dan, thanks for making the time for us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so the past 2+ years have been very difficult for a lot of people, the pandemic. But while we know it's been tough on our mental health, the suicide rate is actually down the last 2.5 years?
Yes, during 2020 and 2021, we actually saw a slight decline in suicides. People were really more intentional about staying connected to people. So if somebody had depression, people reached out to them more often. Somebody was struggling with anxiety or a substance abuse issue, they made more time for them. They were really intentional, and that's really important. The more we can stay connected to people that are struggling, the better off we are. And that actually drove down the suicide numbers in those 2 years.
Wow. Okay, that is really an important message to hammer home, and really ironic that came out of the pandemic, because I know the rate was on an upswing for like the 2 decades before the pandemic, right? Talk about some of the stressors and the causes.
That's true. For many years, we've seen a slow but steady increase in the number of deaths by suicide. And there are multiple factors, not only economic impacts, social impacts, homelessness, medical impacts in terms of chronic diseases, the aging population, our veterans. So there were a whole host of things going into the rises that have gone on for the last 2 years, the 2 decades. In the last 2 years, we've actually seen people reaching out for help more, reaching out and staying connected to people, and that's made a significant difference. Now, unfortunately, some of the early reports from 2022, we're starting to see that rise again as people get back to their normal life. We're seeing less connections, people not reaching out to their healthcare providers as much, not taking their medication as prescribed, not going to therapy appointments as they were, and rises going up.
You know, normal life is not always easy, especially for teens. I hear anecdotal examples of kids having a hard time acclimating after they've been kind of online and not in social groups for a couple of years. And I know especially for teen boys, the rate is some 3 times higher than for girls. Can you talk about the different ways to help a teenager?
Yeah, I mean, tragically, we have seen rates go up for teens. Now, out of all the age groups, teens actually have the lowest number of deaths by suicide. So out of 45,000 deaths, about 6,000 are teens. That means the majority are adults. But teens are really struggling because of this hybrid work hybrid schooling that they've been doing, lack of social integration and understanding how to socialize when they haven't been able to see their friends, missing out on activities like homecoming and proms. All of those major life milestones they've been missing out on. So what we need to do is make sure that they get as much as they can that's as normal as possible, especially as they reintegrate this year and we see kids going back to school. We need to get them involved in the activities that they normally would be involved with. We need to make sure that they understand that there's still support systems that are available to them as they struggle to reacclimate and learn how to do classes academically in school versus doing it online. They really struggle with online learning. Now we're getting them back into the classroom, and we haven't given them the adjustment and told them how to do that in a safe way. So we really need to find ways to support the young people as they're both doing social things as well as academic things.
And I know you've developed suicide prevention programs for schools to try to help kids and foster those conversations. But when it comes to conversations, I have to ask, because I think a lot of people wonder about this, which is, if you see someone who may be under duress and you're worried about their mental health and potentially harming themselves, does bringing up suicide lead to suicide? I think that's a worry a lot of people have.
It is a worry. It's a great question, and it's a really important question. We need everybody to understand that just asking about suicide or bringing it up actually doesn't increase their risk. It decreases their risk of dying by suicide. So we want people to feel safe and comfortable asking the question, as hard as it is to ask, because we know it reduces the level of anxiety and distress that the person is having. So it doesn't lead somebody down that path. It doesn't make them more at risk. It actually helps them if we ask the question. We need to ask it really clearly and directly. We can't dance around it, though. We can't just say, oh, you don't seem like yourself today. If you're really worried about somebody, ask them how they're doing. Say, have you been thinking about taking your life? You've been thinking about just kind of checking out, especially for young people. Do you not want to be here any longer? Do you not want to be around your friends anymore? Those kinds of questions are really important to ask if we're worried about somebody who's at risk.
Dr. Reidenberg, thank you for giving parents and other loved ones the language to begin these conversations. And of course, I know you wanted to talk about 988. We don't have time, but I'll just say that's a new national hotline people can go to as a resource to get help. Thank you so much for coming on the show today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Coming up next, San Francisco libraries are taking challenges posed by the pandemic and really turning them into opportunities. We'll find out how from San Francisco Standard reporter Liz Lindwister next. What we read and how we read says a lot about us. In San Francisco, after a long pandemic closure, the public library system is back big time. Our media partners at the San Francisco Standard dove into what types of materials and which titles are most popular. And joining us live to talk about it is the Standard's reporter, Liz Lindwister. Liz, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Oh yeah, this is fascinating. Like, the San Francisco public libraries were closed for a long time. I remember the city using librarians to be contact tracers because they had nothing else to do. So how is business these days, as they say, at the library?
Yeah, well, the librarians I talked to, Michael Lambert, the city librarian, they're all saying that business is coming back to normal, as close to normal as they can be. Circulation numbers, which did take a big dip during the pandemic, are starting to rise back to the original numbers and even start to surpass the last record of high circulation. And, you know, the library is finding other ways to serve San Francisco outside of just, you know, renting out books and movies and other things.
Like what? I guess that's the part I'm super interested in, is how did it evolve, its mission or purpose during this period?
Yeah, so I think that the one thing is that the public libraries have always been offering services outside of just book circulation. So they've always provided career services, help with access to computers and other electronics, free Wi-Fi, and even, you know, just in the wake of the heat wave this past weekend, they provided cooling centers for San Franciscans. I think now it's just a lot of people in the city are starting to realize that the library has a whole range of services that go beyond just the books that are on its shelves. And they're also adapting to a more online environment with more e-media and more online virtual kinds of events.
Yeah. Oh, I've always thought of it as a community space, right? Gathering place. But what loaners are becoming more popular and which ones are losing popularity?
Do you mean by type of book or the kinds of peoples that are coming into?
Yeah, people renting CDs, movies, ebooks, or, you know, regular books, you know, that you have to flip the pages on. What's becoming more popular? What's trending?
Yeah, so I think it might be no surprise that even before the pandemic hit, physical books started to go down pretty significantly in popularity. But since the pandemic happened, ebooks are really getting popular, audiobooks. And then there's also been something called like this revenge of the analog. So vinyl CDs are really popular in a lot of the branches in the libraries. They're among the top 10 most circulated items. So in addition to seeing the kind of natural progression towards electronic that you would normally expect during a pandemic, there's also kind of a nostalgia with vinyl and CDs getting a little bit more popular.
A little throwback. And I promise it's not just me renting them all out or loaning them out. Hey, what are the most popular book titles? I know we just had that graphic up, but I'm going to put it up again because I think what we choose to read says a lot about us. And if you happen to know if those are popular national choices, or are we kind of going in our own direction there?
Yeah, so when you look at the top fiction books, a lot of those are pretty common authors. So you see Sally Rooney and some others that are like Pulitzer Prize winning. But when you look at the nonfiction, especially, a lot of those books are also very popular, like Michelle Zauner's Crying in H Mart. But I think from looking at them, they kind of seem to represent the diversity of San Francisco as a city. So, you know, one of the most popular books was this book called Bad Indians, which is about the Mission indigenous people who were taken from Southern California to San Francisco. And so you'll see a lot of San Francisco history books that are really popular in the nonfiction and even in the fiction department.
Well, we have about 30 seconds left, but I've got to ask you, are you noticing big differences from branch to branch?
Yeah, so I think one of the cool things about SFPL is that they have like 27 branches in addition to their main library. And each one really does tend to kind of reflect the culture or demographic of the neighborhood that it's situated within. So when you look at circulation trends at like the Chinatown Library or the Western Addition Library branch, they tend to show books that are representative of their patrons. So like the Chinatown Library mostly circulates Chinese fiction books, Western Addition, Japanese nonfiction. And you'll see that kind of across the board.
And it is truly a system that has something for everyone. Liz, thank you so much. I think your article is fascinating. I encourage folks to check it out on your website.
Thank you.
All right. And indeed, you can check that one out. Also, more of the San Francisco Standard's other original reporting on their website, which is sfstandard.com. And ABC7 will continue to bring you more segments featuring the Standard's city-focused journalism. Look for that twice a week right here on Getting Answers at 3 p.m. We'll take a short break and be right back. Thank you so much for joining us on this interactive show, Getting Answers Today. We'll be here every weekday at 3 on air and on live stream answering your questions. World News Tonight with David Muir is coming up next. Have a good day.